All right, well, welcome to episode 2 of Hip Hop Reminiscence. We got our man Fuzz Jackson. I'm Joe Rosen. Last week, we started out talking about conscious rap, and we had a really good conversation about what constitutes conscious rap. Are there conscious rappers? Are there conscious songs? And we really got into that. Today, we're going to go kind of with a more mainstream topic and talk about the top rap albums of the 80s. We're going to see how much we can get through because we're trying to keep these episodes, between 40 and 50 minutes. And there's so many albums we can talk about, but we're going to get into a bunch of them here. You're going to see some of Fuzz's favorite albums scroll along the bottom. You're going to see some of my favorite albums scroll along the bottom. And we're going to kind of keep the same format that we did last week. I'm going to answer some questions. I'm going to bring Fuzz in. We're going to debate a little bit. We got some really cool stuff to talk about today, and we appreciate you being here for this tonight. So, Fuzz, my first question. So, as our albums, and we can't call them albums, right? They were in the 80s. They were still albums at that point, right? So, right. As we talk about albums, the one that I see, there's actually two, but we're going to talk about one for now. The one that I see, which is my number one, which isn't in your top 5, which I'm really, really curious about, is Nation of Millions by Public Enemy. And I'm going to throw something out there, like just throwing it out there. I personally think Nation of Millions by Public Enemy is the best album in any genre of all time. I think if you're comparing genres, like if you're talking about, some of the best albums of all time, and I'm not a big rock guy, but like, Nirvana, Smells Like Teen Spirit, Guns N' Roses, you're talking about some of these albums. Nation of Millions, to me, is the best rap album of all time. But I'm curious, you got some great ones, and we overlap on a few of our top 5, but how did Nation of Millions not make your top 5?
Actually, Nations, in my opinion, it is a wonderful album, one of the most influential albums, right, in music history. But I have to put that in the political category.
Okay,
as most prolific political album, just for the sake of it's straight up and down politics, straight up and down social awareness. A great album. But I feel like that album is so serious, you can't really put it in any other category but that category, in my opinion. Like,
fair, yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish, please.
No, I was just saying, like, because, and I say that in a good way, Joe, because the album, if you say that album to anybody, especially anybody our age, that album would probably be in everybody's category, right? As far as like top 10 hip hop, top 5 hip hop. But in my opinion, that album is so special. You have to put it in its own lane, it's number one in its own category. So I'll put that in the most like political album ever. My personal top 5 are albums that had like a moment in my life, like as far as like I remember like the first time I heard it. I remember the first concert I went to where it played, and I didn't really get into Public Enemy until like high school, so it was kind of like early 90s. But I mean, I can't argue, Joe. That is a prolific album, and I know guys that listen to metal back then who put that album in their top list of albums ever.
Yeah, so I could definitely see that. And I mean, the thing for me, and this gets to, I guess, the next question, and you kind of answered it right there in terms of how you look at a great album. What makes a great album? To me, and then I'll get to your thoughts, it's definitely like place and time, right? Like when it came out, what you were doing, what was going on in your mind. To me, there are certain, and we're going to talk about Run DMC probably a good amount here, and you have King of Rock in your top 5. I don't even have King of Rock in my top 10, and I'll talk about why. We'll talk about that later. Raising Hell, I definitely do have it in my top 5.
Right.
But for Nation of Millions, you have Bring the Noise, Don't Believe the Hype, Rebel Without a Pause, Night of the Living Bassheads, Terminator X, Black Steel and the Hour of Chaos. You have so many songs on there that there wasn't a break. You know, when I look at my favorite TV shows of all time, I always talk about shows like Ozark, The Wire, Vikings, shows that never took an episode off. There's a show out right now, Fuzz, that I've been trying to get everybody to watch called Gangs of London. It's on AMC Plus, which no one has, but it's such an unbelievable show because it never takes an episode off. And I kind of compare that to Public Enemy with Nation of Millions in that it just never took a song off, right? Like you look at Run DMC Raising Hell, and we both have that in our top 5. And it's definitely a top 5 album. You know, Chuck D talks about how he wouldn't have even made, you know, records. I mean, that's what caused, right, him to start making records was Raising Hell. And it definitely had a lot of songs. But like you even look at Raising Hell and you got songs like Dumb Girl, which probably, you know, isn't their best music. You know, even You Be Illin', which was on the radio, but isn't like their best music, right? And I feel like Nation of Millions just didn't take any songs off.
That's a very, very good point. And you know, and when you listen to that record from start to finish, it is like a roller coaster.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a ride that does not stop, bro. Like, and not only that, like the mixture of what like the beats that the Bomb Squad did at the time were just amazing, man. No one had that sound. No one rapped like that. No one mixed their albums like that. That album was so big in so many ways, lyrically, beat wise, the way it was put together, the track list and everything. Hey Joe, let me ask you this: would you say it's one of the most important records in hip hop?
100%. I think it's one of the most important records in music. I think that, you know, Public Enemy took things to a different level. They just did. And I mean, you have there's one other album that I think is really influential as well. And it's not in your top 5. It's in my top 5, which is a close second for me, which is Straight Outta Compton, right, by NWA. And that was very influential too. But I remember, you know, I listened to Public Enemy. I remember when Yo Bum Rush the Show came out. And, you know, if I had a top 25 list, I would put that in there as well because I thought that was, you know, the start, right? That was the start of Public Enemy. Very, very different album. There were some political cuts on that. Not everything was political, right? But on Nation of Millions, you know, most of it was. I think, I don't know, when you compare albums across all genres, it's hard to find a more influential album than Nation of Millions.
Yeah, and not to mention that with the with them being on Def Jam, right, and with Rick Rubin having a little bit of a lot of say in the production along with the Bomb Squad. I mean, a lot of people don't know this, but man, they sampled Slayer. They sampled a lot of different rock riffs, heavy metal riffs. Like, but here's the thing that I think that people don't realize too, Joe. Public Enemy's always been on the cutting edge of production, of lyrics, even the collaborations. Like, if not to jump off the subject a little bit, but even if you listen to Fear of a Black Planet, when you hear Burn Hollywood Burn, like that's probably one of the biggest collaborations in hip hop with Big Daddy Kane and Ice Cube at the time. Yep. So they've always been on the cutting edge. But that album, man, it is an important record for sure.
And let me ask you this: other than like Place and Time, which you talked about, and I agree 100%. You know, like I say, Nation of Millions is the best album of all time. It's actually my second favorite album of all time, if that even makes sense, right? Because Low End Theory is my favorite album of all time. That's a 90s record. We'll talk about that another time. But to you, and the reason I like Low End Theory more than Nation of Millions, even though I think Nation of Millions is probably a better album start to finish, is Time and Place. It was freshman year of college. I remember everything. I remember when Check the Rhyme came out. I remember when Scenario came out. I remember every single thing about it where I was. But what do you think makes a great album? Is it the amount of hits on it? Is it not taking a break? Is it time and place? Is it production quality? Is it all of that?
I think you named every element just now with that question. It's all of those, I think, personally. And I think that's why, like, even when you said Tribe Called Quest, right? Place and time,
Yeah.
production, and I think that was one of the first records like Dilla really jumped on with Tribe. So that's why that record sounded different than the first one, you know. And then it was popping like with that record, it popped off at a time where the fashion was changing, everything was changing, lyrics, everything. So I think that's one of those examples of one of those records where it has all those elements in it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I agree 100%. And I guess also why I'm curious too, because I think NWA is hit or miss with some folks, but you don't have NWA in your top 5 either, and that's another album to me that doesn't really take a song off. I mean, there's a couple, but I mean, for the most part, but you didn't have Straight Outta Compton in your top 5 either.
Nah, it's definitely on my top 10,
Okay.
but it's not. It's definitely not. It's not on my. It's you know what I think because I think it's not on my top 5 because of it took me a while for that record. It took a while for me to catch on to that record because I wasn't experiencing a whole lot of what they were talking about. And to be honest with you, it scared the hell out of me. Like, so it took me a minute to adapt to it. But once I locked in on it, I totally got it. But man, my top 5 is weird because I can tell you where I was. I can tell you there's a story behind each of those records. And I think that's why my top 5 is so weird.
Yeah. And I hear it. And I think Eric B, one thing I want to talk to you about in your top 5, we have some overlapping ones, right? Like Raising
Right.
Hell overlaps, License to Ill overlaps. True, like I love the Beastie Boys. I mean, obviously, love everything they've done. I think a lot of Beastie Boy fans think License to Ill is the worst album that they ever did. I disagree. I think it's the best album they ever did because I think it's the most hip hop. I know they got hosed in the deal, and I understand that. So like they don't really like to talk about that as much as the later albums. But I think we have License to Ill overlapping, we have Raising Hell overlapping, we have Paid in Full. You have Paid in Full 1, and I have Paid in Full 5, and the reason Paid in Full is probably better than 5. In fact, it is better than 5 because his lyrics are just ridiculous. Like he might be the best lyricist ever. He's
Ever.
top 3, top 4. But I was talking to JR, our producer, right before you came on, and my only issue with Paid in Full, and I listened to it this morning, is the production quality isn't great. You have to turn that, when I have it on, I have to turn it way up to like even hear it. And I understand that was like back in the 80s, there were some albums like that, like 3 Feet High and Rising's like that. But Follow the Leader isn't like that, right? Their follow-up wasn't like that. I think it was just some of the production quality. And so like to me, you talked about Nation of Millions production quality and how good it is. And that was why like Eric B didn't have that, even though the lyrics are just ridiculous. I mean, ridiculous. I know you got soul. I mean, some of these songs are just absolutely ridiculous. But let me ask you a question here because I actually listed 25. I'm nuts. I listed 25 albums that I thought were the top 25 of the 80s. And we're not going to talk about 25 albums. This podcast would be 7.5 hours if we did that. But in the 80s, and I don't know that this is the case in the 90s, we will see when we get to the 90s and talk about albums in the 90s, how it comes out. But in the 80s, in the top 25 albums that I list, there are so many groups or artists that have more than one record in the top 25. Or more than one album in the top 25. So of the 25, I'll tell you what I have, and you give me your thoughts on this, and I'm curious why. Is it lack of artists? Is it just because some guys were so far ahead of the time? But I have 2 Public Enemy albums in the top 25, Nation of Millions and Yo Bum Rush the Show. Okay. I only have 1 Run DMC. You have 2, so we'll count that here. I have Raising Hell. You have King of Rock. 2 Beastie Boys albums, License to Ill and Paul's Boutique. 2 BDP albums, By All Means Necessary and Criminal Minded. 2 Eric B. and Rakim albums, Paid in Full and Follow the Leader, 2 Big Daddy Kane albums, Long Live the Kane and It's a Big Daddy Thing, 2 LL albums, Bigger and Deffer and Radio, and I think that's it. But, I mean, that's more than half the list if you're listing 25.
Yeah.
So is it just that those artists were so ahead of their time and just putting out hits and hits and hits? Or why is it? Because now if you look at it, sometimes it's just like an artist has one really good album and then the rest are okay. But if you look at these 80s albums, these guys were just putting out album after album.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of it has to do with consistency, right? Like, I mean, you're talking about LL and Big Daddy Kane in their prime, Rakim in their prime. Those 3 MCs alone were probably the most consistent. And then if you want to go group or posse wise, BDP was definitely consistent, not only just in the studio, right, doing shows, right, but just on the whole battle tip. So I think at that time, man, everybody knew, except the labels, what hip hop was going to be. I think the artists knew, the DJs knew, everybody knew what hip hop was going to be. And I think they got ahead of the game and just stayed consistent and really were ahead of their time and just pumped out as much music as they could. And I think that's why you have a lot of those artists on your list like 2 and 3 times. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And you could argue, and I know a lot of people would argue, Run DMC could have 3 albums on there, right? I mean, you could put the first Run DMC with Sucker MCs on there. You could put that one on there too. And I mean, I've had a hard time. Like, I've been going through this. To me, there are some clear winners, and I think you would probably agree with me. And we'll talk about a couple of them that I don't think are clear winners. Public Enemy, I think Nation of Millions is better than Yo Bum Rush the Show. I think you would probably agree with that.
Oh,
Let's talk about, we'll talk about Run DMC later. We both agree that Beastie Boys' License to Ill is better. I think BDP, even though Criminal Minded had a couple more songs, Poetry, The Bridge is Over, South Bronx, by all means necessary with My Philosophy, I'm still number one. Like that was just game changing right there. I'll give you my thoughts on Run DMC. And the reason why I think Raising Hell is so good, and I'm not a huge fan of King of Rock. I think King of Rock might be their best song ever. But I think the album is weaker than some of the others on this list. I think that Raising Hell, and I'm not a huge fan of songs like You Be Illin' and things like that, but Walk This Way, obviously, just was new and different than anything that's ever been done before. It's Tricky was like my favorite song in the world in 1986. You had Peter Piper on there. I mean, you had so many different songs. Is King of Rock completely place in time for you, or are there records there that I'm missing? Because I definitely could be.
I think it's definitely, for me, it's more place in time for me. Because, I kind of felt like they saw how much success they had off of Walk This Way. And they're like, yo, we're going to do a whole album. Let's try to do a whole album like this. And I think because of the riskiness of it, I liked it. It's definitely not their best record, but I think it's one of their most innovative ones. You know what I mean? Especially coming off of the success of like Peter Piper, My Adidas. But the last song on that album though, oh man, Joe, I can't think of it. But it's the one where Grandmaster or Jam Master Jay cuts for like 5 minutes straight. Daryl and Joe.
Yep.
That record right there, for me, that record, in my opinion, is the best closing record on an album.
I can see that. And King of Rock, King of Rock was the precursor for Walk This Way, right? Because King of Rock was them just busting it out with the guitars and things like that. And they were ahead of their time on that. Yeah. And that kind of led into Walk This Way.
That's right. King of Rock was second, right, Joe?
King of Rock was second, yeah. And then they did Walk This Way, right?
Yeah. You're right.
Let's get into, so I go back and forth on LL and Big Daddy Kane a little bit. And I've asked a couple friends what they thought on this. And so you have Radio by LL on there, and that's really hard to argue with because LL, I mean, you have I Can't Live Without My Radio, you have Rock the Bells. I listened to that today as well, and I forgot how many, like, I'm like, oh, this was on this one, this was on this one. Obviously, Radio and Rock the Bells were the two biggest songs, but he also had I Need a Beat and the wholly underappreciated, underrated Dear Yvette. Like, that song was unbelievable,
Yo,
right?
bro.
Right? I mean,
Yes.
that song was amazing. And you listen to Bigger and Deffer, and it didn't have as many hits as Radio did, but it had probably the two biggest hits LL's ever had, right? Like, I mean, in Bad and certainly I Need Love, which was the first
Yeah.
real rap, like the first superstar rap ballad that I lip synced to from like 1980, whatever it was, 87 to 89. Like, that was my first lip sync song. Like, that was
Yeah.
when you called it lip sync and not karaoke, even though like karaoke singing. But
Right.
I would agree with you. I think Radio is a little better than Bigger and Deffer, excuse me. The Big Daddy one, I'm really curious your thoughts on this because like Long Live the Cane was eye-opening for me, and you're right about the consistency. Long Live the Cane had Raw, Set It Off, and Ain't No Half Steppin'. Those were the three big songs on that one, right? And those were monster hits. Ain't No Half Steppin' was probably his biggest hit. But it's a Big Daddy Cane. It's a Big Daddy thing, which had Mortal Kombat, which wasn't a big hit, but I love that song. Smooth Operator, Wrath of Kane, I Get the Job Done, Warm It Up, Kane, and Pimpin' Ain't Easy. It had all those songs on it that people forget. Like, I think it's hard to it's hard to say one's better, but if you're going just by number of hits, it's a Big Daddy thing had more hits.
Yeah, I think it's a Big Daddy thing was really like the start of the commercial success, right? Like when that hit, like everybody took Kane seriously. You know what I mean? Because that first record was just so raw, and the whole Rakim Kane comparison started happening, right? And but I think as far as like commercial hits, that next one was out of here. That was a Hank Aaron home run on that one, bro.
That was. And Pimpin' Ain't Easy. Like Pimpin' Ain't Easy was different too, right? He brought in Nice and Smooth, and I know Nice and Smooth weren't the most respected MCs, but I loved them. I thought they were great. They were so different. Yeah, they didn't say anything, but who cares? Like, I mean, not everyone has to say anything. And now hip hop, like, I feel like people don't say enough, right? But back then, everybody was saying something, and Nice and Smooth wasn't saying anything serious. Yeah, I'm not gonna say they weren't saying anything. But when you went on Pimpin' Ain't Easy, that was just a little different than what Kane had done. I want to throw. There's another three on here that aren't the same artist, but I think they're related. Well, they're definitely related, and I want to talk about these because if I'm gonna put, if I'm listing number 6 after the top 5 that on my list anyway. It's probably 3 Feet High and Rising, but a close one to that. And I don't know what you're going to think when I go here, because it's his only album, not his fault, but it's his only album. Was the DOC No One Can Do It Better? And you had that NWA Dre connection, right? I mean, I would put 3 of those albums in this list. I would put NWA Straight Outta Compton, the DOC No One Can Do It Better, and then Eazy-E Easier Said Than Done. Even though Easier Said Than Done, I think is still a really good one, probably the worst of the 3. But the DOC, Fuzz, it's Funky Enough, The Formula, DOC and the Doctor, Whirlwind Pyramid, even like his songs that weren't hits or anything were just ridiculous. And man, like we're gonna do this, we've been talking about doing this what if episode, right? Like, what if Biggie and Pac lived? What if DOC didn't get into a car wreck? Like these types of things. That was the one guy I look back in the 80s and I'm like, man, I wish that guy obviously stayed healthy and was able to make albums for a long period of time. What are your thoughts on that album?
That album, wow. I remember waiting for that album to come out, and when it came out, I was not disappointed at all. And I think everybody was rooting for him so big. You know what I
Right.
mean? Because you had the whole NWA movement, but he just sounded so different. And a lot of people, and a lot of us didn't know. I didn't know until after the wreck that he was from Texas. I
That's
thought he
right.
was a West Coast guy. Like I thought he was a Cali guy. Um,
Right.
but I will say this, and I don't mean any disrespect by this at all. If I always say, if what happened to him never would have happened, we wouldn't have had such a great Chronic record. I
That's
believe.
true. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I hate to sound like that, but you know, sometimes things happen for a reason, so to speak. And I know he had a lot to do with that Chronic record. He had a lot to do with a lot of death row stuff that was successful. But that Chronic record, I know he did a lot of the writing for that record. And that record wouldn't have been what it was if he didn't have anything to do with it. So
That
that's
makes sense.
kind of the positive way I look at, what happened to him. But yeah, that album, that first album, his only album, it was amazing. It was
Yeah.
crazy.
It was fantastic. So, talk to me about the differences in styles here, right? When we get to the 90s, we're probably going to talk about heavy differences in styles, right? Because the 90s, now you're really getting in. Now, you got a couple Native Tongue albums in here, and we'll talk about, Jungle Brothers in a little bit. But, you had Three
Right.
Feet High. You had 3 Feet High and Rising. You had Jungle Brothers, but no Tribe in the 80s, no Black Sheep in the 80s. Most of the De La was in the 90s after 3 Feet High and Rising, right? So if you're looking at the styles in the 90s and we get to the best hip hop albums in the 90s, I think you're going to see very, very different styles. Here, there's not as many different styles. You talked about it, the comparisons with Big Daddy and Eric B and Big Daddy and Rakim, right? You had the Run DMC Beastie Boys, even though they're different rappers, same kind of style, right? Same
Right.
kind of
Right.
thing. Public Enemy was a little bit of different style. Then you had NWA, NWA DOC, Eazy-E, with the West Coast and stuff like that. But like we're talking pretty much about similar styles throughout the top 25, not completely, but more so in the 80s than the 90s. Is that just because of the development?
I think so. Um, I think when the 90s hit, Joe, I think things sped up as far as like, putting the product out, um, people being in the studio more. And I think people started realizing how important hip hop was becoming. So I think a lot of people had to kind of change their styles up. Because if you think about it, when the 90s hit, right, we went from gangster to everybody being peaceful to everybody, when that switched, everybody else switched. So yeah, I think like the styles developed, production developed,
Mm-hmm.
people were starting to use the SB12s and stuff more, and things were changing.
Yeah, I think it is true because I did notice that, and I've been listening to these albums all week, and I've been trying to just compare because you never compared back then, right? I mean, there was so much good hip hop in the late 80s and 90s that it was almost hard to compare. You just wanted to listen and do it. But now, like, I'll go listen to an LL album, and then I'll go listen to Rakim, and then I'll go listen to Big Daddy. And I don't think I ever realized how similar Rakim and Big Daddy were. And maybe people will disagree with us on that. But I listened to a Big Daddy album right after I listened to a Rakim album. I'm like, this is similar.
Yeah, yeah. And you know what's crazy? We never got a record from them together.
Yeah, you're right.
We never. Like, now that's a what if. Like, what if that would have happened?
You're 100% right. Yeah, I mean I'm with you for sure. And like even when you get into the 90s, there's so many different styles. Like I mean, Illmatic was in the 90s. We talked about that, right? I mean, talk about the differences. My two favorite albums in the 90s, and we'll get there obviously in the weeks ahead, but my two favorite albums in the 80s are Straight Outta Compton and Nation of Millions. And while they're different, there's a lot of there's similarities there. My two
Right.
favorite albums in the 90s are Low End Theory and Illmatic, and they're completely different. They might as well like just be two different forms of music. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like man, it's kind of crazy because like when you look at the 80s, for every 80s record, you could like fast forward to the 90s and make that comparison and that similarity and kind of see how it jumped back full circle. Does that make sense?
It does. No, it definitely does.
Like
It was
it's
just,
kind of crazy.
yeah, and it was just the development too. I mean, you see how, I mean, 3 Feet High and Rising is my favorite De La album, but they got, on De La Soul is Dead and some of the albums after that, De La Soul is Dead was a fantastic album.
Yeah.
And they changed. I mean, the production quality increased. I think things were just getting better, right? I mean,
Yeah.
things were just getting better. There was more to work with. There was more technology. There was just a lot of different things that they can do. And that, I guess that leads me to sort of my last topic here, Fuzz. And I really want your thoughts. We're talking about the standards here. Run DMC, LL, Big Daddy Kane, Eric B. and Rakim. It doesn't have to be in your top 5, doesn't have to be in your top 10 or even your top 20. What are some of your favorite? I know you talked about Diamond D last week. Like, what are some of your favorite 80s albums or songs that may not be considered top 25 material by many people?
Mantronics, Gangsta Boogie.
Okay.
I think Mantronics is and y'all out there that's watching and listening, look up Mantronics. Mantronics is a group that if you talk to any other producer from that era, they will put Mantronics on that list. They made the song Gangsta Boogie. I feel like Mantronics is definitely overlooked. I feel like if you really want to go deep, if you go back to the late 80s, mid 80s, Awesome Dre and the Hardcore Committee from Detroit.
Oh wow,
people
you're
forget
going
about
deep.
them.
Okay.
Yeah, people forget about them, and they that was just something different, man. That we weren't used to. So I was living in Georgia at the time, and I had never heard a Detroit rapper until I heard Awesome Dre and the Hardcore Committee. That's an album that needs to be on the list for sure. And you know what else we didn't talk about, even though it's not hardcore boom bap rap, but we didn't talk about UTFO.
That album was amazing. They had remember they sang a song on that album. They had like an R&B song. I can't even remember what it's called right now, but they had an R&B song on it. Something, was it Lisa something? No, that was Lisa Lips. That was a different song.
I forgot. They did have and their DJ was nice.
Yeah.
The DJ was crazy.
That was a great album. Yeah, you're going back too.
Yeah,
you're going back to like kind of early mid 80s, right?
Yeah. Because there's a few records, man, at that time, because it was so much coming out and it was so new. There's a few records that got overlooked. Like if you look at in that era, my favorite Posse cut has to be the Symphony. Like by far. By far. And once again, Big Daddy Kane was in the mix, and we forgot about how the whole Juice Crew movement, really changed a lot of stuff. Here's a fun fact for you, Joe. I don't know if you knew this. Did you know that Rakim did all the cuts on the Paid in Full album?
I did not know that.
Yes, he did all the cuts on the Paid in Full album. And if you look on the back of the record, I'm not talking about 50 Cent Curtis Jackson, but the real 50 Cent that he named himself after is on the back of that record.
Is it really? Okay, I did not know that.
Yeah.
Man, so much stuff about things that like I don't even know how I wouldn't even be able to ask the question. I wouldn't even know the question to ask in order to get the information that you have, which is awesome. Like, I think that's great. And I think that I'm a fan. You're a rapper. I know you're a fan too, but
right.
I'm a fan, somewhat of a historian, I guess, but and you're a fan and you're a historian, but you're doing it too, right? I mean, you're doing it. So, I mean, you're looking at I love it. You're looking at things that I'm not even like, I don't even know the questions to ask. And I think that's great. I'm gonna throw, before we leave, we got about 5-6 minutes here. Before we leave, I'm gonna throw out 6 albums. One I'm gonna definitely lose credibility on, and that's totally fine. I already lost some credibility last week. I understand that, but I'm gonna throw 5 or 6 albums out here that I think are incredibly underrated. I think No One Can Do It Better by DOC is definitely one, but we talked about that. So, all right, number one, and then I'm going to list them out, and then you give me your thoughts on these, and then I'm going to ask you specific thoughts on one album, which is, again, my lack of credibility record. But number one, and one album we haven't talked about, I'm not putting it in the underrated, is Strictly Business by EPMD. We haven't talked about that one, and that one definitely belongs in the conversation. All right, but here are the 5 or 6. Jungle Brothers, Done by the Forces of Nature, which was 1989, right? Slick Rick, Great Adventures of Slick Rick in 1988, which is spectacular. You know my fascination and love of Third Base. And the Cactus album came out in 1989, which I think is an incredibly underrated album. The Ultramagnetic Emcee's Critical Breakdown in 1988. You know, I didn't listen to that album in the 80s. I don't even think I knew it existed in the 80s. I started listening to Ultramagnetic Emcee's Critical Breakdown about 10 years ago, and there's not a lot of hits on that album, right? Ego Trippin' was probably the only hit, if you want to call it a hit.
Right.
Every record on that album is unbelievable. They do not take anything off. And I say it's underrated, but if you look at lists of the top 80s albums, it's always there. So maybe it's not. And then I'm going to throw 3 more at you just to complete the 25. I think this is one more than I said I was. Bismarcky Going Off, right? Which had Nobody Beats the Biz, Vapors, Picking Boogers, Make the Music with Your Mouth Biz. And then the 1 or 2 where I'm going to lose a little credibility, and it's fine. I loved Dana Dane growing up. I thought he was so different. I'm like, who is this British guy rapping? And he wasn't even British, but he had, but he was a storyteller, right? Him and Slick Rick were storytellers, and he had Cinderfella, Nightmares, Delancey Street, Dana Dane with Fame, and then the album that it came out, which was such a pop album, but if you listen to it now, I think it's a really, really, really good hip-hop album, is Stone Cold Rhymin' by Young Emcee. I think back then it was just everybody listened to Bust a Move. People that didn't like rap, they listened to Bust a Move. Bust a Move is fine. It's a good song. It was probably one of the biggest pop hits of any rap record ever, other than maybe like, you know, You Can't Touch This by MC Hammer.
Right.
But it also had Fastest Rhyme, Principal's Office, which was a storytelling song, and then one of my favorite songs of all time is on that album called Know How. And I'm a big movie guy, and one of my favorite movies of the last, I don't know, I think it was 2014, 2015, was this movie called Baby Driver. And it had a really good soundtrack, and it was about a getaway driver who was deaf or hard of hearing. And the last song he drives the car, the getaway from, was Know How by Young Emcee. And I was so excited. I'm like, how does anyone even know this song? So of that like random list that I just gave you, that's a lot of different styles too. Anything stand out there, or are you going to kill me on my Dana Dane love?
No, you know what? I rock with Dana Dane. I love Dana Dane. But I just always thought that Slick Rick was just a tad bit better.
Oh, he was, yeah.
But I like Dana Dane, though, because if anybody else could do that besides Slick Rick, it's only Dana Dane. But the Young Emcee, I would definitely say, yeah, props to putting, like, for shouting Young Emcee out, because people don't understand that Young Emcee changed the game. Like, you know, he's still getting paid off those records.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I met him at a Dragon Sunglass party in California years ago, and he was the guest performer at this party. And I walked up to him and was talking to him after he did his set, and he was talking about, he's like, yeah, I still get paid from Bust a Move and all the stuff he wrote. You know, he wrote Wild Thing too, right?
Yeah, by Tone Loc, right?
I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So he's contributed a lot, and it's a shame that people really don't talk about what he did for hip hop. Not only that, he showed people how to write a hit and make money off it.
Right, he did. And I mean, that was kind of the start. When I look back in the 80s and early 90s, and I think about like the first hip hop hits on the radio, like not It's Tricky, not Paul Revere. I mean, they were on the radio, but they were on like hip hop radio. I'm talking about on pop radio, right? Top 40 radio. And the songs that I always think about, and I know I'm missing some, were Bust a Move, Can't Touch This by MC Hammer, and then probably Just a Friend by Biz Markie, right? Those are the three songs that were on like mainstream radio. And I know there's more. Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince, they had a couple, obviously. And but those are the three. Parents just don't understand. That's probably, one in there as well. But those three were the ones. And, Jazzy Jeff and Fresh Prince, there's a couple albums in the 80s that could be put on this list too. I just looked at them and I listened to them a little bit, and I didn't think they were as complete as some of the albums we've talked about.
Yeah. And if you were going to put something on there, you have to put He's the DJ and I'm the Rapper.
Right. Yeah.
God.
I don't even remember what year that was. That might have been 90.
Was that like 89 or 90? It
was right there. Yeah, it was right there. I think I'm not sure. And it's right there though. But I mean, they had fantastic albums. They had the album with Brand New Funk. I mean, they had phenomenal songs, but to me, it wasn't like as complete as like, some of the records, some of the albums that we're talking about, right now. So, man, it's really hard to do an analysis of all the best 80s hip hop albums or any albums in 45 minutes, but I think we kind of did our thing. Anything else you want to talk about, Fuzz, before we wrap it and get ready for next week?
I think that's it. Oh, it came out in 88. You know how He's a DJ and I'm the Rapper came out in 88.
Oh, it did. Okay, so that probably should have been on our list. You're right. Okay.
But you know what, Joe? I got one more for you. X-Clan.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We got to make sure we throw that on the list. X-Clan. I think the name of the album is their first album is called To the East Blackwards.
I think that's right. Yep.
It's a must. Yeah. That is if anybody out there is a hip hop connoisseur, that is an album that you need to put in your collection for sure.
They were political like Public Enemy, but they made dance records. I mean, effectively, right? I mean, Funkin' Lesson. I mean, they made dance records. Public Enemy wasn't making any dance records. No. I'm trying to think if they made any dance records ever. I mean, no. I mean, Can't Trust It, kind of a little bit, but not really, right? Yeah. I mean, you could dance to that, but it wasn't a dance record. Like X-Clan was popping out, dance records a little bit, but just we appreciate it. We're gonna try to get an episode out, every week, every 10 days. Worst case scenario, to keep talking about old school hip hop, talking about, just keep this in the discourse. Again, my name is Joe Rosen. He's Fuzz Jackson. Fuzz, tell them where they can hear you again.
Yes, you can go to fuzzjax.bandcamp.com. Check out my music. You can go to Instagram and check me out. One word, your mom's favorite rapper. Facebook, Fuzz Jackson. And North Jax on Twitter. That's NORTHJAXX. By the way, the new mixtape, Action Jackson, will be out this Friday on Bandcamp. Make sure you download that.
I love it. And I'm JoeRo24 on Twitter, and we have a Hip Hop Reminiscence Twitter handle now. It is Hip Hop Remin, REMIN. We got that going. There's not a ton up there, but there will be, and we'll get some other social media going as well. And for Fuzz Jackson, I'm Joe Rosen. We really appreciate you tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
Peace.